Hello, everybody. Welcome to this discussion about how to find the funds for journalism to thrive. And I'm laughing because this is everybody's challenge, everybody's struggle against a backdrop of very significant additional external threats to press freedom, threats to the safety of journalists, threats to democracy and journalism's role as an essential pillar of a functioning democracy. My name's Julie Posetti. I'm Global Director of Research at the International Centre for Journalists, ICFJ, and we were commissioned by UNESCO to produce the study that, the policy paper rather, that we're going to be launching in the next few minutes. And I'm joined by an impressive panel of experts on this theme, starting with Dr. Anya Schiffrin, who's the Director of the Technology, Media and Communication Specialization at the International and Public Affairs School at Columbia University. And next to her is her fellow Columbia journalism academic, Professor Emily Bell. I went to call you doctor, but you're much more of a professor. But you are indeed a professor at the Tao Center, which is the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia. And to my left is Sola McCabe, who is the Deputy Director of UNESCO's International Program for the Development of Communication. I think I got that right, which is IPDC. And to her left is Branko Brkic, whose name I always mispronounce. So apologies again for doing that. And he's warned me the next time I did it there would be punishment, so I expect that's coming. But Branko is the founder and the editor-in-chief of the daily Maverick in South Africa, which is an incredibly successful and very important news website, which has also generated a newspaper in recent times in the country, which is up against it constantly when it comes to trying to find the funds for some of the most important investigative journalism and analysis in the country. So thanks very much, everybody, for being here. And I'm going to ask Sola to intervene first and to talk to us about why UNESCO, why the UN is investing so much effort and energy in questions around media viability and the sustainability of journalism.
Thanks very much, Julie, and hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here in this wonderful city. So yes, I wanted to take the floor to just briefly explain why UNESCO decided to commission this policy brief and how it fits in to the wider efforts of UNESCO to tackle the financial challenges that media organizations are facing in many countries around the world. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, the world became acutely aware of the crucial role that credible and professional journalism plays in our daily lives, and of the importance of being able to rely on the information provided by independent media to access verified information and to expose disinformation. And more recently, the war in Ukraine has provided another brutal reminder of the importance of a free flow of information and access to trustworthy news. And yet, independent professional journalism is clearly under threat. The traditional business models of media organizations are facing serious challenges. Advertising and subscription revenues that pay for the production of news have been eroding for years. And today, two companies, Google and Meta, receive approximately half of all global digital advertising revenue. And at the same time, in the last 5 years, global newspaper advertising revenue has dropped by half. The financial impact of the COVID-19 crisis has further aggravated this situation and led to the loss of countless jobs in the media industry and the closure of a number of media outlets. So to address the challenges in media viability, it's important to first understand them. So that's why UNESCO is leading an international data collection, research and consultation effort to first lay out a clear diagnostic of the situation, map out the lessons learned from this crisis and figure out ways to guide policymakers and media actors in their response to the financial crisis. So UNESCO, as the UN agency with the mandate to promote freedom of expression, media development, and access to information, was well positioned to carry out this initiative. And this mandate was further strengthened by the Windhoek Plus 30 declaration, which was adopted at World Press Freedom Day last year, and which was then endorsed by UNESCO's 193 member states. And this declaration calls for information to be considered as a public good and to be protected as such. So we would like this crisis to stimulate a reflection on policy measures that can be taken to tackle this existential threat that journalism is facing. And this policy brief, which perhaps Julie can show here, which was commissioned, and the authors of this policy brief are here, and I think they will be able to explain in great detail all the findings of the policy brief. But it's really a key part of this drive for a collective action in favor of the viability of independent public interest media. So the brief provides a typology of global responses, it assesses their pros and cons, and it makes 22 actionable recommendations that build upon the principles of this Windhoek Plus 30 declaration. Yes, do I need to finish? Do I have 1 more minute?
You can have 1 more minute.
Wonderful, thanks. So really very quickly, just to say that in parallel, UNESCO has partnered with several actors in a data collection effort, so including with the Economist Impact, which was formerly known as the Economist Intelligence Unit. And this is research that focuses on the impact of the financial impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in 10 countries. And also this has been complemented by national consultations and knowledge exchanges between media outlets in those 10 countries in partnership with the NGO Free Press Unlimited. So during these consultations, media leaders and stakeholders were asked for their proposals to preserve media viability without compromising editorial independence and journalistic integrity, and that's really key. And just finally, to finish, UNESCO has also produced a handbook in 5 languages on inspiring practices from countries around the world, focusing on what selected media organizations have done to try to reinvent their business models and find new ways of surviving in this difficult financial context. So I'll stop there, and thank you for allowing me to make this introduction. And
not at all. And we'll come back to you, Surla, as the panel proceeds, I think, just to understand in more detail how UNESCO and the UN wants to take this forward in a practical way. So this is the brief, as I've held up before, that UNESCO commissioned from ICFJ and in partnership with our 2 colleagues from Columbia University. Anya Schiffrin was the lead author of this brief. So I'm going to come to you first of all, Anya, and I'm leaning forward to try and see you. It's wonderful to make eye contact after a couple of, or at least a year, back and forward on this this policy brief. So, from your perspective, as somebody who is, really one of the leading experts internationally on, you are, on the viability of journalism, what do you think is the most important takeaway from this policy brief? What is the top finding and the top recommendation?
Yeah. Ooh, sorry, is this on? Great. I think the top finding is my light was on. No? Yes? Thank you, everybody. Great. It's great to be here. And yeah, Julie and I had a year on Signal, so we actually only met for the first time yesterday, and Emily and I work about a block away from each other, and we're also on Signal the whole time. So really glad to be with everybody. This is very exciting. It's the first time I've written anything for UNESCO, and I have to say, really, all the reports and the research have just been top-notch. We worked with the Economist Impact Unit, as Sarla said, and everyone came up with so many interesting findings. I think my top finding is that even though we all spend so much time sitting around worrying about the state of the world, what became clear during the pandemic is that there's been this massive experimentation all over the world to try to save journalism. And, we all expect that people, countries like Sweden or Denmark or France are going to try to help journalism because they've been doing the right thing for decades. I think the amazing finding is that Tunisia, Indonesia, Lebanon, Senegal, Colombia, and all these countries that don't come to mind immediately have been trying to come up with ideas for how to help support quality information and journalism. So I think that's been super inspiring, and I'll just give you a few examples from our research. And there's several buckets that fall into. One bucket is, of course, this growing feeling that it's time for Google and Meta to step up and give us what we deserve, which is money. And governments have been looking at this in a whole lot of different ways. So as you know, there have been multiple attempts in Europe to get copyright revenue out of Google and Meta. That's been difficult. So many of you probably saw that Australia passed the News Media Bargaining Code in February 2021. And no one's nodding, so I'm going to explain to you what the News Media Bargaining Code is. Maybe one person's nodding. So what the Australian Competition Authority decided to do, Rod Sims, was to tell Google and then Facebook that they had to come to agreements with media outlets about how much money they would give them for the use of their material. And if they couldn't come to an agreement, then they would have to go to binding arbitration with the Australian government picked arbitrator. So that did a few things. One is that gave Google and Meta immediately an incentive to start giving money to media outlets. And it also gave other countries the idea that they should do the same thing. So that law got passed. We write a little, there's lots of information online about how they lobbied against it, how they threatened to cut off Australia from news, things like that. But it got passed, and hundreds of millions of dollars have been given out to news outlets in Australia as a result of this law. There's been a lot of criticism because who owns most of the outlets in Australia? It's obviously Rupert Murdoch. They have the largest market share, I think, between 60 and 70%. But other countries started saying, we'd like to do that too. So South Africa and Senegal have both been looking at doing their own versions. Canada is passing theirs probably in the next week, and Brazil is expected to vote in the next couple of weeks too. And so this is money. It's not an ideal situation, but it is money that can help media outlets. So that's one dramatic headline from last year, which we write about a little bit. And the point of this report was really to give advice and ideas to governments that are interested in trying to support quality information and journalism for the public. And maybe I'll just touch on a couple more things that we've been seeing globally. Obviously, in many countries, media outlets were eligible for COVID bailouts and stimulus packages. So there's a slew of countries where media outlets got that money. Another thing that's being experimented with in various places are tax credits. So, for example, if you hire journalists to cover local news, you can maybe get a payroll tax credit. A number of countries got rid of VAT on newsprint, for example. So that was like a whole other bucket of things that we saw around the world were attempts to cut taxes for news outlets. And then a few places have experimented with the idea of subscription vouchers. So you give members of the public, $50 or $100 or $200 off their taxes if they subscribe to something for the first time. Those we don't have all the great data yet. Those seem to be less successful. We've heard some, pretty bad horror stories in some places, such as, Seattle, where it really hasn't worked out. But the point, I think, the real headline, is that there's tons of solutions. It's a question of political will and making sure that, governments and citizens understand how important journalism is, quality information is, and take steps to do something about it.
Yeah, and let's focus on political will, because in the last 24 hours, in fact, Brazil killed that bill, which is extraordinary, and they killed the bill in the context of what some have argued is a disinformation campaign run by the platforms against the bill. So that bill, under the influence of very heavy public relations, and influence operations in Brazil convinced the Bolsonarist government that supporting critical independent journalism in the form of
The whole entire bill?
whole bill's being-
or different bits of it?
So this just happened yesterday, my understanding, and this is confirmed by, I don't know if we have Patricia Campos Melo in the room.
Yeah,
that I
she's
had,
following it very closely.
yeah, so she told me at dinner last night the details, and I briefly had a look at it. So it's literally just happened. And so her analysis, which parallels analysis that we've seen in other countries, including Australia, my homeland, where this bill was proposed. There were actions by the platforms to curtail it, contain it, all manner of efforts. And one of the arguments put in the Brazilian context was that that it would disadvantage small independent media to pursue this policy. And unfortunately, some of the small independent media came on board with that narrative. And so now we have a situation where that funding will unfortunately not come as expected. So that's...
Can I interrupt 1 second?
Yeah.
My husband, who's an economist, says it's always the big companies that say, oh, what about the little companies? That's like a standard line that people always use. Right? Yeah, they don't really care about the little guy. They just bring that out. Yeah.
A really important point. And, and I think, this idea of political will and the fact that this is all playing out in the context of, anti-democratic movements and autocratic governments, and this crisis of disinformation is really relevant. So, these solutions are not just about economics, are they? They're also about the social and political. Emily, can I come to you next, just in the context of jolt you out of contemplation? So to come to the platforms question, which is, the natural seg here. So there are two things that come out in our policy brief. One is the way in which the platforms are arguing against these kinds of interventions. The other is the function of the platforms, as Anya's pointed out, in contributing financially to the sustainability of journalism, given so much of the revenue that was previously sourced through advertising traditionally and then digitally. What are the risks and challenges around reliance on funding from the platforms, from your perspective and your research, in terms of the appropriateness or otherwise of accepting such funding, and what measures could be put in place to ensure an arm's length approach?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So one of the big challenges, I think, for funding, and maybe this festival is partly a demonstration of that, is many newsrooms have become extremely comfortable with, and to some extent dependent on, collaboration with platforms, particularly Google, Facebook, but I would also include Apple in that at this point. The problem is that some of this funding is not transactional. It's given in the form of grants. There's a lot of obscurity sometimes about why the funding is given to which outlets. We've been conducting a long-term piece of research at the Tower Centre which tries to actually trace individual pieces of funding to which outlet got what, where. There have been several good studies on this, but nobody has complete data. I would say that we've sort of aggregated everything available. There's still a sort of a data hole of about sort of 50 to 60% that we can't account for. So the first thing to say is that you have this about $200 million, I think, a year at the moment coming from platforms into global journalism. We don't exactly know where it's going. The newsrooms are not transparent either. So you also, it's really difficult to know exactly what the overall effect is. And the other thing is it could all go away tomorrow. You could cynically say, this was always going to be the case because the platforms are not journalistic companies. It's not their main business, they're advertising platforms. And the money that they are putting into the journalism sector is often stewarded by extremely well-intentioned, highly knowledgeable people, quite often from the journalistic field themselves. But the core purpose of the companies is not to support journalism, it's to make money for their shareholders. And if they wanted it to go away tomorrow, or if they needed it to go away tomorrow, then it could. So first of all, there's no stability and guarantee. Secondly, there's no real transparency, and there's no real transparency actually under the Australian News Media Bargaining Code either. So you could receive a large check from Google, which some companies have in Australia. You don't have to spend a penny of it actually on Australian journalism. It can be given back to the holding company. There's no public ledger of where this money is spent, whether these are actually, and Rod Sims was very transparent about this. He said, this is a competition fix. This is not actually something where we don't care if people sign NDAs, we don't care if there's no transparency. My understanding of the Online News Act in Canada is that transparency is one thing that they are trying to introduce into it. It's a very odd position, I think, for two of the major funders of journalism, or certainly crises in journalism, to be in, that we don't really have accountability or traceability of funding. We can't really assess impacts in markets in a research outlet. And we're talking to other journalists who do work in this area. Even just evaluating, like, what is the impact? Has it, has it overall been a sort of a beneficial thing for the field? This is really important stuff that we need to know, because it can inform how we move forward with funding. So I think there are sort of several problems to it. I think that some of the legislation that we're seeing coming through now, as Julie says, Bill's just been killed in Brazil. There's also the JCPA in America, which is a 4-year safe harbor for news organizations to collectively bargain with platform companies. But it's just been introduced into Congress, and as I said yesterday, a separate panel. To use a vivid metaphor one of my colleagues at Columbia used, it's like watching watching a bowling ball pass through a snake. It's very slow, and it's uncertain that it's ever going to reach the other end. So whilst it would be good to say, in the heart of capitalist America, where these companies actually can be are not currently regulated or held to a sort of an accountable standard, you do have legislation now which opens the door to a more stable bargaining environment. But the chances of it actually passing into law, I think, are pretty low. So I think that, I think we want their money. This is one of the arguments we always have. We want their money, but we also want their money on sort of terms which reflect, I think, sort of civic interests and a level of transparency, and also an ability to assess impact and direct those fundings. And just one more thing, which is, I don't necessarily think it's healthy. This is where I actually side with the tech companies. I don't necessarily think it's healthy to have very specific companies bound to the future of journalism in quite the way we have at the moment. So hopefully, as I say, some regulation is better than none in this area. Exactly. We've drawn some lines at the moment. Australia's drawn some lines. They probably need drawing in slightly different places. But we're also seeing checks being signed around the world by tech companies into newsrooms. And we're seeing, in America, for instance, the Coalition to Rebuild Local News, Steve Waldman, I was on a platform with him last week, and he was saying, a lot of my members are not actually in favour of this legislation. And I said, do those members receive funding from Google and Facebook? And he said, probably some of them, yes. So again, sort of actually lobbying, so maybe one of our top line findings should be lobbying works. So those are sort of, sorry, that's maybe
Julie,
sort of gone a bit long. Yeah.
Sure, briefly, because I want to get to Branko.
Oh yeah, no, not too long. But I guess a couple things. One is, I think you've made a really good point that part of getting political will be to keep improving these laws, and they're going to have to iterate. And one of the French regulators said to us recently, the early money laundering laws were don't bring a suitcase of cash to the bank. They're more sophisticated 20 years later, and that's what we're going to have to do here. And one thing I found super interesting when I was doing all the research is journalists get really emotional, and everybody starts to get very angry and say, I hate the Australia bill, or it's not fair, it's only going to the big outlets. But the economists I spoke to were really much more pragmatic. And they sort of said, you don't always know what's going to work. You don't always have the data. You have to do what's politically feasible. I called up a lot of economists and said, are tax credits better or vouchers better? And they said, what's better is what you can actually get passed. So I do think that, it's such an urgent situation that if we sort of sit around and wait 10 years for the perfect data or the perfect law, we're not going to get anywhere.
That's a really important point, and I'm glad you made it now in the context of Emily's points about accountability and transparency, then the iterative nature of responses that can be tested, and these have to be, to a degree, experimental, but hopefully with capacity to ensure that the funding is not just transparently delivered and subject to accountability measures, but also that it does go directly to fund public interest journalism. So I'm looking to you, Branko, now to talk to us from the ground. A lot of these initiatives that we've assessed have had mixed impact. We don't yet know whether any of them will work effectively, but from where you're sitting as a subsistence kind of journalism farmer, so to speak, with very serious investigative projects that are very costly. First, what's your reaction to this set of recommendations? And well, in fact, first, please tell us, in your experience, whether any of this can work, and then perhaps to react to the recommendations.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, first, I would like to see myself more as an artisan farmer than subsistence farmer. Thank you very much. Okay, so look, I've done something happened today, which didn't happen for a long time in my life. I actually met a reporter that I like. It actually educated me about stuff, and I actually liked it. And I agree with everything you guys say there. My problem is that it's still getting money from all these sources, and we spent much of our time talking about getting money from Facebook and Google, is basically a band-aid to a problem which is much deeper. And the problem is the problem that we actually will have to wrestle at some stage with. And I think the sooner the better. And humanity makes mistakes all the time, and humanity made a mistake by agreeing that Facebook, Twitter, and others are actually platforms and not publishers, not media houses. So there's a fundamental issue that I have with that, because we live in two different universes. And I'll give you an example. So every night, we have a big night production. I go to bed, and I worry that if I put a word in the wrong way, a single word, those are the same days where some of my journalists, especially female journalists, are getting 60 threats of rape per hour on Twitter. And I don't see any of Twitter, guys going to bed worrying about it. I see them going to, all the way to the bank. I mean, Twitter is $40 billion today. The New York Times, the leading light of the global journalism, is $7 billion. So Twitter, the bottom of the humanity, is $40 billion. So just want to point it out. And there's a fundamental problem there. Where we are not treated in the same way. So Twitter and Facebook and all others are allowed to behave like media, okay, and be unpunished like a platform, like AT&T. And as long as we have that dichotomy, we're not going to be able to do anything. So everything that you guys are doing, and it's incredibly laudable, the fundamental problem is not solved. Because when they take all the money off the table, okay, one of the ways they're going to go and fund these things. They're going to come out and they're going to dole out 0.05% of the money they're getting through from the content that we create, and they're going to be seeing themselves as gods. So we have a fundamental problem that we as a humanity, we have to solve. Because again, these people are publishers. On one side, they claim they're AT&T, they just provide a platform. On the other side, they're buying production companies. They're proud of the material which is produced on their platforms. They actively apply algorithms. Algorithm is an act of publishing. Okay, so we have a serious problem there, and unless we admit it and actually do something about it, everything else we do, every other law that we have to do, every other negotiation with Facebook and Twitter is still just how much money we can squeeze out of which is a fundamentally wrong system. And just to add to it, the problem is if they actually to be treated the same way as we are treated, okay, which is let's care about what's on their platforms, okay. They have to apply fact checkers, employ fact checkers, and then for 3 to 5 billion people on Facebook, they have to employ probably 2 or 3 million fact checkers. Suddenly, the geniusness of a Facebook model is not so good. Because, Facebook is actually 2 companies in one. One company is these geniuses that are writing code, and second is a service. Whilst the geniuses who write code are brilliant, the guys who supply service suck. Me as a publisher, I have to care about all of these things. They don't have to care about any of the thing. As long as they have the situation, everything else is going to fail. And mark my words, we're going to be talking about this in 10 years' time, except we're going to be even poorer.
Yeah.
And we'll never be able to solve this problem.
And it reminds me very much of debates of decades ago around whether you're facilitating the growth and sustainability of a population versus whether you're trying to apply Band-Aid measures. So I think powerful points made there, and your fundamental view, Branko, is that there needs to be responsibility in addition to transparency and accountability on the part of the platforms.
No, all we just ask, treat us the same way.
Yeah,
that's all.
But that obviously involves, from your perspective, editorial responsibility.
Absolutely.
When it comes to publishing.
What a novel concept. People who make hundreds of billions of dollars should be, held to the same account.
Which gets back to political will to an extent, because is it possible to legislate in that way, for example, and to achieve support for regulating responsibilities when it comes to editorial publishing applied to the platforms, when you have a small community of massively wealthy big tech companies that are so effective when it comes to information operations that suit their policy positions?
I would remind you about Theodore Roosevelt. He was facing much more powerful people with robber barons, and he managed to get them out. The reality is that this is literally the life or death issue. And Facebook should not be split in the first times of splitting a WhatsApp and Facebook or Instagram. We should split the code and the service.
Can I ask, Anya, what do you think about Branko's points when it comes to, and Emily, if you want to chime in on that as well?
Did you want to go first? I guess the quick thing I would say is that all of these companies aren't paying taxes, and that's what they should be doing. They should be paying taxes, and governments should be allocating those taxes. And I think that would be a big picture solution, because if they were paying taxes, that would really help. But anyway, Emily, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I think it's in the policy solutions paper where people have suggested, for instance, micro-targeting, advertising tax, etc. There are lots of broader solutions within this. And much as I like to rant about Google and Facebook, I think we do have to sort of broaden it out. So that not the question is to what extent is there political will to really get involved with the reordering of the information society, which has been ordered in a chaotic and commercial and largely unregulated way in the last 10 years, just because of the development of Silicon Valley technologies. And actually, as Branko was speaking, I was sort of thinking that, one of the issues, this sort of question about, how can you compel, or should you compel, or what are those sort of, it's really difficult actually when you get into the field of content moderation policies, or actually sort of saying what should and shouldn't be carried on certain platforms. The DSA, Digital Services Act in Europe, and the Online Harms Bill in the UK are interesting in that they sort of start to introduce this language of risk assessment and the ability to audit companies' abilities to mitigate harms and risks. And again, back to Julie's point about sometimes not everything is Anya's point that sometimes not everything is perfect. People have already sort of looked at the Online Harms Bill in the UK and said, what is harmful but legal content. What do we even do with that? That's not a definition that lawyers particularly, or anybody is particularly sort of comfortable with. But yet we do have to start, I think, sort of describing some of these shifts in the environment that we're uncomfortable with and that are disadvantaging more expensive public interest news. And it can be about risk assessment. I think it's also, there's an uncomfortable question for all of us here, which is, what is a news organisation? Categories within, taxonomies within platforms are pretty arbitrary. They're very widely drawn. Every time you introduce legislation, you have to be able to define who would be a recipient of the funding or who wouldn't be a recipient of the funding. And I think that's something we haven't talked so much about. But actually, you know, everything from those taxonomies within platforms to the definitions within legislation, I think need a clear understanding of what is journalism and what isn't. And I know it's like one of those, we know it when we see it. I'm just going to refer back to something I talked about this morning, which is the Rockbridge project, which was announced yesterday in the United States by Peter Thiel and Rebecca Mercer, who are on the right. And they are reshaping the Republican Party. And they said, well, the project, which is going to fund influencers, investigative journalism, and various other things. And the words investigative journalism really jumped out there because this is a reshaping the Republic. This is political lobbying money. And yet these kinds of efforts are labeling journalism in a particular way. It's going to make Branko's job really hard. It's going to make, you know, our colleagues in news organisations' jobs really hard if what you're trying to do is produce good faith journalism in an environment where you have the same privileges and accesses and the same labelling applied to projects which are fundamentally either political lobbying or bad faith or advertising or public relations or whatever.
Can I come in? A couple of points. One is that we just had a super interesting, very small conference at Columbia a couple weeks ago on government policies to support media. And by the way, the follow-up will be October 21st, so if anybody wants to come, please email me. You can find my email address on the Columbia website. And Emily was there, and Annette Novak was there, who was one of the people who helped design Sweden's media subsidy and public support policies, as I understand. And one of the things she said was, you'll never, don't even try to define what a journalist is, because it's actually not possible. You know, they spent months and then they gave up. So I thought it was so interesting that they've had such a successful program of support without ever actually solving that completely. The other thing I want to say about this report is that one of the things I really like about it, and I have to thank Julian and the editors, is the way that it's structured, which is there's something in it for everybody. So if you are determined, you know, if you're really determined to tax big tech and use the money to support journalism, we have like a page of recommendations. If you're sort of at the very beginning of the process, then Guy Berger, you know, got my researcher and me to like add in a whole section on how you set up a commission of inquiry, which like the Karen Cross Commission, just like a baby step for the first thing a government can do is just like set up a commission, take a close look at kind of where your media ecosystem stands and sort of make some sort of recommendations. And so I thought one of the things I really liked is, we have a whole page on tax credits, who's doing them. We have lists of government policies that work, again, pros and cons, as Sarla suggested. So I think if any of you are government officials who are thinking of supporting journalism, I think there'll be just so many things in here that I think we wrote this so that it could really work for a lot of different countries. And in fact, BBC Primed even called and said that Sierra Leone is sort of starting to think about all of this. And, hopefully this report will be useful for people trying to do practical things apart from the goal of, getting the platforms to help pay.
Indeed. But of course, we have to take into account the geopolitical realities that there are so many states, even those that might express initial interest, and whether it's altruistic motivation or not, will potentially pull back if they dislike the implications of maintaining critical, independent journalism. And so there is no one-size-fits-all, I think, even though this is a kind of global set of recommendations. So to Anya's point, we may not have a single person in the room who's a government policy advisor, but we have plenty of journalists probably who specialise in various ways on whether it's within economics, whether it's in the context of reporting on development, or even the media beat, which is increasingly about viability and sustainability. But I want to come back to you, Branko, because the points that have been made around, yes, it is extremely difficult to define the role of a journalist or the function of a journalist, not the role or the function, but what is a journalist is a difficult question, although the UN has kind of, concluded that it's acts of journalism that are more important to understand rather than the individual function of an individual journalist's, role. But what should be easier to define is what is public interest journalism. And I just want to hear from Branko, from your perspective, if some of the recommendations around ensuring that investment is focused on public interest media, public interest journalism are undertaken, then what, from your perspective, is public interest journalism practiced in South Africa? And can you share with us how that is currently being threatened today?
Yeah, look, South Africa experiences many problems that the rest of the world experiences, and one of the biggest one is the media desert. As you said, every country has its own very specific position, and for many years, South African media was controlled by the SABC, which is the South African version of BBC, but not, of course, not being a state broadcaster, not a public broadcaster, and the 4 big media organizations that were competing among themselves in a cozy relationship and making a lot of money. The problem is that, whilst doing it, they, especially for the first 2 decades of this century, they did not create much of a new talent. And then the internet started to bite big time. Facebook and Google, before mentioned, Facebook and Google started to bite big time, and big chunks of South African media have collapsed. And the first thing that collapses when you cut the costs is the journalists, And so in early 2010s, big number of journalists were retrenched and replaced with wire copy. And then we ran out of wire copy because the agency that was providing wire copy went under. So we were left in a position where the journalism was critically injured, and Khadija is here. She spent a lot of time with me there in that space, so she understands it well. The problem is, as you know, when journalists once leave the profession, they don't come back that easily. And to replace them, you need to have people who are doing it for at least 5 to 10 years, probably more. So we in South Africa now are facing a couple of critical problems. One of them is kind of the number of remaining good journalists is going down, and pretty drastically. The media deserts are appearing, and then what we're facing also are concentrated efforts to destabilize the whole system. And I'll give you an example. In 2020, just as the pandemic started, the xenophobic campaign started. It was extraordinarily successful on social media, and these days has comfortably jumped from social media into real world. These days people are dying. People of Zimbabwean, especially, and Nigerian, they're dying in South Africa. So those are the issues that we're facing right now.
So you mean that the fact that there is this vacuum of critical independent journalism is leading to a failure to counter narratives around racism and mob violence that spills offline?
Well, you're saying it very cleverly. I can't even respond to that. But what I'm just trying to say is that we actually have no way of reporting on all these things. And the problem is that most of the things that happen, you actually start being aware of it only when they metastasize and explode. And I'll give you a small example. I don't know if you guys are aware of 2021 looting spree in South Africa. And that was much more than a looting spree. That was a coup attempt. And it was in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, which are two of the biggest provinces in South Africa. The third one being Western Cape. And, the problem was that those things were happening, fermenting for many, many months. And we just were unaware of it. Why? Because we didn't have many people in KwaZulu-Natal. Why? Because we couldn't afford to have many people in KwaZulu-Natal. So you have this media desert. We have, no journalists present. You have no contacts to understand the magnitude of that. And if we had more journalists, if we had more resources, we would probably have been able to in a way, stop it. We couldn't. Just at the end, almost 400 people died, and $3 billion in damage was caused.
And you really are one of the few independent news media institutions left in South Africa, and the other, we were one of the traditional news groups which is called independent media, but today is not necessarily independent. So you're dealing with sort of not just state-captured media, but media that's been captured by other political actors, and this is an issue that we address in this policy brief. But can I just take us back to that question, because I think it's really important about where the money is going, to what kind of institution is it going. And one of the criticisms of the Australian bill, which is definitely held up as an example and has many merits, is that it effectively further enriched the Murdoch press. And this was one of the arguments used in Brazil to counter the support from traditional media. But so from your point of view, what is public interest journalism in South Africa? What are the kind of qualities that investors should be looking for when they're trying to support independent media?
Well, we as one of the benefits of investing into Daily Maverick or helping Daily Maverick, we would say you get to have a country, which is right now at that level. Look, the government has invested a lot of money, especially during Zuma times, into the Gupta media, so-called, which are the infamous brothers Gupta who left the country after Gupta leaks that we broke. And then now they invested a lot of money into independent news media by another one of their people. Advertising, we never get advertising from government. We are one of the biggest websites in the country. We never get anything. The money is, unfortunately, and then there's another element here, is that overwhelmingly large number of companies and corporations that could invest, could advertise, are afraid of the government and afraid of our ANC to invest with us.
So Branko has just outlined quite a few of the risks we've identified in this policy brief from a on-the-ground perspective. Can I ask you, Sola, if you don't mind, thinking about what you've heard here, working as you do at the helm of the IPDC, which is one of the UN-based organisations that's specifically tasked with investing in media development. I mean, what do you take away from this policy brief and from hearing from Branko particularly, bearing in mind, a lot of the interventions that you're able to make are very small, in terms of dollar signs, they're really small amounts of money. So, just what are your thoughts about how to respond at the practical UN level in terms of investment in critical independent journalism?
So I think, yes, in terms of what we can do directly as UNESCO is provide support to local media organizations through small-scale grants, which we do through this program called the IPDC, the International Program for the Development of Communication. But what we also are doing as in our role as a standard setter and a convener of different actors who can play a more impactful role in changing the situation is, well, on the one hand, producing this kind of policy brief to really provide concrete recommendations as to what can be done to improve the ecosystem that media are working in. And what we want to do next is to bring together the different actors who can play a role in actually operationalizing these recommendations. And as you were saying, Julie, there's no one-size-fits-all. So as a first step, we're planning to carry out roundtables organized roundtables in the 10 countries that were the focus countries of our research, our wider research on media viability, and see what measures concretely in those countries they feel are most relevant to the national context, and bring together the actors that could actually play a role in operationalizing some of those. And in parallel to that, just responding to Emily's point about the need for greater transparency within the internet platforms, on how, how their activities impact on media viability, on how, when there are revenue sharing initiatives, how those revenues are being determined, how the sharing is being determined. So we want to also carry out an international consultation to determine what would be the data ask. So what exactly would be the elements that would be needed to get from the internet companies to be able to, basically what data influences media viability. So, what, for example, data on how they promote journalistic content or not, how they pay for the content that they are producing on their platforms or not. So that's another area that we'll be working on, and then carrying out further consultations to see how we could advocate for that data ask to actually be then responded to either through self-regulation or through regulation if needed.
Okay, so trying to actually extract the data that all of us want from the platforms about distribution. We're running out of time, so I'm going to get the three of you, as well as spoken, to sum up now, please. What is your biggest ask, Branko, or your greatest concern about implementing some of these policies or responding to the crisis in general?
I just want to offer a rule of thumb about if people want to help media. And the rule of thumb is that if there is a national media, there is a national discussion, national discourse happening, then it's actually first and foremost we need to invest into the media in media deserts and small independent outlets. However, when the countries are burning, then the small outlets really can't help much. You actually need to invest at the guys at the top, because those are the guys who actually hold the countries together.
With audiences, in other words.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think you haven't said this yet, but I think
just a rule of thumb,
Yeah, but as a rule of thumb, your reach is extraordinary.
It's 6 million per month.
6 million per month,
Yep.
unique users
Yep.
For a very comparatively small independent news organisation, which is as I said, one of the few left standing. So those are also very relevant issues, including and other issues include equality of access to information. Paywalls and subscriptions are perhaps
I think
relevant
it's crucial
to this discussion.
to be free for everybody.
Yeah, in the context of democratic erosion, then there's a different set of questions and challenges. Emily, would you like to go next, and then I'll let Anya have the last word.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of try and inject a note of optimism, which is that, wish me luck, which is at least we're having, I've been coming to this festival for quite a few years, at least we're having this conversation now, and at least we understand that there is a problem and that actually policy plays a part in it. I think that's a really significant shift. I worry about the political will part of it. We see governments who are essentially hostile to the role of the accountability press sort of everywhere in functioning democracies as well as in authoritarian states. But I do feel as though there is enough, if there's enough traction around this, that governments and bodies who want to make an impact now know that they have to focus on this issue. And this is not a sort of a nice to have, this is kind of a fundamental to democracy. So how are you actually going to construct that within your country if you are a government that wants to see democracy flourish? It's no longer just a sort of a slogan of like the press is a pillar of democracy. It's a demonstrable truth that we're seeing play out in all parts of the world at the moment.
Including the US.
Including the US.
I agree completely with Emily. I mean, who really would have thought that the Build Back Better would include 3 tax credits for journalism, or that Brazil under Bolsonaro would be discussing this? So that's the first thing. Incredible progress, just at least in discussion. Number 2, again, there are mechanisms. The Independent Fund for Public Interest Media, local funds to support local journalists. It's not either or. It doesn't have to be support Murdoch or support, niche local news. There are ways, there are measures. People are doing these things successfully all over the world. And then the final point is it's really important for journalists to get involved in these conversations, I think. I think we all need to be really advocating for ourselves. And the time is so gone. I'm so tired of we can't trust government, we can't trust this, we can't trust that, it's impossible. there's great solutions. There's lots of things. They're not always perfect, but that's what we should be putting our energy into and making some of them actually get funded, you know, again, like IPFIM and other initiatives. So that's what I think.
Thanks very much,
Thank you
Anya.
very much.
And we're not allowed to ask you to ask questions because of COVID restrictions, but if anybody has a slight question they'd like to pose it, then we could perhaps...
And we can stick around, and there's copies of the report for people to take,
There are,
too.
exactly.
So.
So we have a whole bunch of copies up the front here, so before you do leave, please take one, and if there is any burning question that you might like to take a risk to ask, then now is your chance. Otherwise, we will thank you and move towards the drinking part and collaborative, solutions-oriented part of the evening. Is that a question there? That was
Not
just
a
a hand.
question.
Was that like, yes, I'd like a drink now, please? I don't know what that was. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. I know, and I'm glad we were able to bring it to a hopeful conclusion. Thank you.
Great.